Hey folks, let's talk about a topic today I've been wanting to cover for a while. Let's talk about fertilizer. Now this is going to be part one of a three-part series covering everything you need to know from understanding what you're actually buying, what kind of products do you need to buy and what are those rates, and then in the last video we're going to dive off into more advanced topics, such as base saturation, fertilizing for a yield goal, and fertilizing for crop removal. But in this video, we're specifically going to dive off into, actually understanding fertilizer. What is it actually made of? What are the different components of it? When you're looking at a bag of fertilizer in the store, how do you determine what it's actually made out of? What's the percentage of nutrients in it and everything? Because the last thing you want to do is spend your hard-earned money on something you might not need, or something that's supplying you with something that you need, or not buying enough of what you need to actually meet your goals. Now, when you're thinking about, say for us, for like a crop, or you at home, for your garden or lawn, would you just go into a store and buy a bag of seed that says seed on it without knowing what actually type of seed is in there? I mean, if you're wanting to plant peas in your garden, you wouldn't want a bag of seed that had corn seed in it, and so on. And fertilizer is a lot the same way. You go look at your garden section, you see all these different packets of seed with different types of plants on there, but you go into the fertilizer section and you got bags that say fertilizer or Miracle Grow or so on, without actually knowing what's actually in there. So that's the topic I'm wanting to cover today. Now, in order to understand fertilizer and how it works, you need to know that plants need basically 17 different elements in order to grow and survive. Now, some of these elements, such as carbon and oxygen, they can pull out of the air around us. And surprisingly, even though our air is made up of something like 78% nitrogen, nitrogen is a critical nutrient, but for the most part, plants can't pull nitrogen out of the air and utilize it. Now, these nutrients are typically divided into two categories: your macronutrients and your micronutrients. Now, all these nutrients are critical, but the macronutrients are the nutrients that the plant needs the greatest supply of in order to support its metabolic functions. And these are the nutrients that are most likely to be deficient in the soil and need to be supplied through by adding fertilizer. Now, your micronutrients, as implied by the name, are nutrients that are not needed in near big a quantity by the plant, but they are no less critical. But generally, because they're needed in such low volume, that there is generally enough of these micronutrients in the soil to support metabolic functions in plants. Now, of your macronutrients, these can be divided into two separate categories: your macronutrients and then your secondary nutrients. Now, your secondary nutrients are just as important as your macronutrients, but generally they're supplied in a plentiful quantity that's already naturally inherent in the soil. But if needed, there are ways to also supply these nutrients through fertilizer. Now, us as farmers, we buy our fertilizer in bulk. We don't have to go to the store and buy it in 10, 25, 50-pound bags like a lot of normal consumers do. And for us, it's a lot easier to determine what we're actually getting and what we're actually applying. But for you as a consumer, when you go to the store, you see a long row of different fertilizers on there, and a lot of them can have confusing and misleading language on them. So how do you actually determine what is actually in that bag and if it's what you need? Now, a lot of these fertilizers, when you're looking at the bag, it can actually be pretty difficult to decipher what's actually in it. Sometimes you've actually got to look at the very small fine print on the back of the bag to find out what the nutrient concentration of the specific nutrients is in that bag. Now, the first step to understanding what's actually in the bag is to understand the guaranteed analysis. These companies are required by law to publish on the label what the actual guaranteed analysis is of the product that's in the bag. And what that means is that while the nutrient concentration that's in the bag could potentially be higher than what the guaranteed analysis is, it will not fall below the guaranteed analysis. Now, when looking at a bag of fertilizer, companies may put the analysis in different spots on the bag. You know, some of the ones I've seen, you know, they've got right there on the front part of the bag, and then the analysis is typically represented by 3 or maybe even 4 separate numbers separated by a dash. Like a common one that I've seen is like a 13-13-13. Now, these numbers represent the percentage by weight of the most common macronutrients that you're going to need: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, or otherwise known as NPK. Now, sometimes you will also see a 4th number on there, and this number will represent sulfur. Now, the first number represents the percentage of the fertilizer that is actual nitrogen in there. The second number will represent the amount of phosphorus, and the third number will represent the amount of potassium that's in the analysis. Now, these fertilizers that you might buy in a bag or in a spray bottle, if it's liquid, are typically a blend of common commercial fertilizers that us as farmers can buy. Now, here's a list of some of the most common fertilizers that you might find in these blends. You've got urea, which is a kind of a slower release form of nitrogen. Urea's analysis is 46-O-O. Another form of nitrogen is ammonium nitrate, even though that's not near as common now because it can also be an ingredient in explosives, and it's really not produced that much anymore. But anyway, ammonium nitrate has an analysis of a 34-O-O. Now, some of your liquid fertilizers you might find in a spray bottle, you know, they might contain urea ammonium nitrate or UAN, and the typical analysis on this is 32-O-O. Another form of nitrogen is ammonium sulfate, which has nitrogen and sulfur in it, and it is pretty popular. It has an analysis of 21-O-O-24, with the 24 being the percentage of sulfur in it. Now, on your phosphates, you've got diammonium phosphate or DAP, and you also got monoammonium phosphate or MAP. Now, the DAP analysis is 18-48-O, meaning it's got 18% nitrogen, 48% phosphorus. Monoammonium phosphate or MAP, typical analysis on it is 11-52-O. Now, if you're needing calcium or magnesium, that typically comes from ground limestone, either calcitic lime or dolomite lime, and that's also useful for raising the pH of your soil, which we will dive off into in the second video. Now, potash is typically supplied in a few different ways. Perhaps the most popular form of potash is muriate of potash, otherwise known as potassium chloride, and the analysis on it is 0-0-60, with it being 60% potassium. You also got sulfate of potash, which is 0-0-50-18, meaning it's also got some sulfur in there. You got potassium nitrate, 13-0-44, means it's got some nitrogen in there. And then another common form of sulfur is elemental sulfur, which is 90% sulfur, so it's got an analysis of 0-0-0-90. Now, there can be several other forms of fertilizer, but these are generally the most common ones available. Now, ideally, when you're wanting to fertilize your lawn or your garden or your crop, you would like to be able to purchase each of these products separately so you could tailor your fertilizer application to what exactly you need, depending on the amount of fertility that's already in your soil, the crop that you might be growing and its fertility needs, and so on. However, it can be difficult for the average consumer to access these raw products just by themselves. I know in our area, the best chance of you getting these individual products would be going to your local co-op that sells fertilizer and seeing if they'll sell you, whatever you need of the individual products. But typically, these products are bought in bulk, brought out in a fertilizer truck, and then offloaded into, a big commercial spreader to spread these products across the land. Now, a big reason you might want to source these products individually is that a lot of these fertilizer blends, might supply all of the nutrients you need, but as the crop is growing throughout the season, it doesn't necessarily need all of those nutrients at the same time. Early on in the life cycle of a plant, phosphorus is a pretty critical element, whereas your nitrogen and your potassium are not near as critical. Now you can apply your phosphorus and potassium at the same time and be fine, because those nutrients are not typically mobile in the soil. Once you apply that nutrient to land, it's typically there on the land until it is used up by a plant. Now some of your other elements, such as your nitrogen, your sulfur, boron, a lot of those are very soluble in the soil, and if you apply them, they're only there for a limited amount of time before they're either gassed off into the atmosphere or leached down through the soil profile with rainwater. They typically don't stay in the soil, especially if you're in an area that gets a lot of rainfall. So if you apply it early in the season, that nitrogen might not actually be there later on in the season when you need it. Now all these fertilizers I've listed are inorganic fertilizers that have either been extracted from the air using chemical processes or mined from the ground and then refined using chemical processes. Now this doesn't mean that these fertilizers are bad, because the elements were already existing naturally. They were just extracted and put into a usable form through chemical process. Now the important thing to remember about these commercial fertilizers or synthetic fertilizers, however you want to refer to them, is that the nutrients from these fertilizers, once they've been applied to the ground and then have been moved into the soil solution either by irrigation or rainfall, is that these nutrients are quickly available for any growing plants to be able to take up and utilize. Now, in addition to commercial fertilizers, you've also got organic fertilizers such as manure and compost. In the background behind me, you can see some chicken litter, which is chicken manure that we have stockpiled back here for use in this coming spring. Now these organic fertilizers, while being a very good source of fertilizers, they are much less nutrient dense than what your commercial fertilizers are. That means you need a lot more volume of organic fertilizers in order to equal the same nutrient content as your commercial fertilizers. And also, not only that, the nutrients from your organic fertilizers are typically not available near as quickly as the ones from your commercial fertilizers, because the parent material needs to be broken down in the soil in order to release the nutrients into the soil solution. And because of that, you won't likely see a very quick plant response from when applying these organic fertilizers, but they are very good for the long-term fertility of the soil because they are released slowly all throughout the year. And when used year after year after year, it adds a cumulative effect in your soil to make your soil very good and fertile. And then not only is the fertility of the soil good in regards to the nutrient concentration, these organic fertilizers also add a lot of carbon back into the soil, which carbon is the basic building block of all life and leads to healthy, more sustainable soils to grow whatever it is you're trying to grow. However, one of the big drawbacks of using organic fertilizers, manures and compost, is that they are not consistent and they can differ very widely in the amount of nutrients they may contain. So take this pile behind me. I could go pull a sample from this edge of the pile and it would come back as one analysis. I could pull another sample from the middle of the pile. It would likely be quite a bit different than the first one, and then the third one from this edge of the pile and would likely be quite different from the first in sample. That's the problem. But here's kind of some general guidelines of what you can expect from your different compost and manures. This chicken litter behind me, typically for every ton of chicken litter that's there, there's typically at least 45 pounds of nitrogen, 45 pounds of phosphorus, 45 pounds of phosphorus, and usually around 10 to 15 pounds of sulfur per ton of manure. This gives it an effective analysis based on percentage of a 3-3-3-1, which, as you can see, is much lower than your commercial fertilizers. Now, chicken litter itself is usually the most nutrient dense of your organic manures and fertilizers. Say you got access to hog manure. While being a very good source of fertilizer, it needs to be applied in a lot higher amounts because to get the same amount of nutrients, you have to apply a lot more. The analysis on hog manure is generally a 0.6-0.4-0.3. And then looking at cattle manure, the analysis on cattle manure is typically a 0.3, 0.2, 0.3. And then horse manure will be even lower than that. Now, like I said, those can still be very good fertilizers. You just have to apply a lot more product to get the same equivalent of nutrients applied to your land. Now, when thinking about manures, if you have a manure that is composted like what you see behind me, it's actively composting, the nutrient concentration of that manure is going to be significantly higher than if you have raw fresh manure, because a lot of that raw fresh manure is going to have a greater concentration of water in there. And as the manure itself is composting, means it's decomposing, the actual quantity there is lowering every single day, but the nutrient concentration in it is rising as that material composts. And then looking at other organic fertilizers, there is nutrient value from other organic products such as kitchen scraps, yard clippings, and tree leaves if they are composted correctly. Now, in general, the nutrient concentration from these will be low, but it does have fertilizer value if you have access to that material. All right, now that we discussed the different forms of fertilizer and their nutrient concentration, let's take a look at some of the products I found at our local Walmart and try and figure out just what nutrients and how much is in each bag here. All right, today I went to the store just to see what kind of fertilizers are available to you as a consumer if you were to go to your local Walmart, Lowe's, Home Depot, nursery, etc. And I looked at the labels of some of these, so I'm gonna try to help you figure out exactly what's in some of these products that you might buy. Now, looking at this first one, pretty standard fertilizer. Notice several things here on the front of the bag. The first thing is that this bag says that this should cover up to 5,000 square feet and feed for up to 3 months. Well, automatically I'll dispute the feeding up to 3 months, because whoever printed that bag doesn't know what type of crop you're growing, the conditions it's growing in, the amount of nutrients that's already in your soil, etc. So first thing to do is dismiss that claim. Now, looking at the bottom of the bag, we can see that this bag has a net weight of 14 pounds, and it's got the analysis on the front of the bag, which I like. This analysis on this bag is a 30-0-4. That means 30% of the weight is nitrogen, no phosphorus in there, and then 4% of the weight is potassium. Now, just doing some simple math here based upon a net weight of 14 pounds, this total bag should have 4.2 pounds of nitrogen and a little over a half a pound of potassium in this 14 pounds. Now, it says that's supposed to go across 5,000 square feet. Now, an acre of land is 43,560 square feet, so 5,000 square feet is going to be a little over a tenth of an acre, 11/100ths of an acre to be exact. So with this product having 4.2 pounds of N and half a pound of K, applying this product to 5,000 square feet would give you the equivalent of about 42 pounds of nitrogen per acre and about 5 pounds of potassium per acre. Now, that 42 pounds of nitrogen per acre, it should give you a pretty visible result in your yard or your garden, whatever you're putting it on. The 5 pounds of potassium per acre not going to give you any kind of visible result. Now, looking on the back of the bag, we get a little bit more details of the guaranteed analysis. As you can see, we got 30% nitrogen, 4% soluble potash, and we've also got a 2% iron in there. And then looking below that, we see the actual fertilizer ingredients that's used to make up that analysis. We got urea, which is supplying the nitrogen, and then we've got muriate of potash, which is supplying the potash, and then you've also got some iron sucrate in there too. Now, that urea and muriate of potash is ones I told you about earlier in this video as being common commercial fertilizers that are available to farmers. Now, looking at the price tag of this, Walmart's wanting $13.47 for this 14-pound bag of fertilizer. Now, does that price make any sense? Is that a good value or a bad value? Well, if I were to buy those same fertilizers myself and blend them together to make up the contents of fertilizer in this bag, it would cost me $2.60 in nitrogen and 19 cents in potassium, giving me a total cost of $2.79 using the commercial fertilizers I can buy at today's price to make up the exact same thing that's in this bag. So you can see the markup on it is pretty dang high for you as a vendor buying it at a store in a prepackaged bag. Now going on to the next one, we've got another fertilizer blend. As you can see on the bottom, this one's got an analysis of 13-13-13, which means 13% of it's nitrogen, 13% is phosphorus, 13% is potassium, and we've got a net weight of 40 pounds in this bag. So using that analysis and the weight of the bag, that means that this bag contains 6.5 pounds of nitrogen, 6.5 pounds of phosphorus, and 6.5 pounds of potassium. Now, being able to figure out how many actual pounds of nutrients is in a bag like this will come in useful once you get your soil test back and you can determine what the actual needs of your land is. Now moving on to the next one. Now we've got a name brand product here. This is Scott's Turf Builder Weed and Feed. Now looking on the front of the bag, we don't see an analysis on there, but it says this bag weighs 11.32 pounds and is supposed to cover 4,000 square feet. But what we do have on here is an active ingredient, and because this is a weed and feed, what this means is that this bag contains fertilizer that has been impregnated with a herbicide. And I'm assuming this 4,000 square feet that it says it's supposed to cover is not based upon the fertility needs, but it's based upon the active ingredient and applying the right rate to control whatever weeds that you need. Now looking closer at the fine print, these active ingredients of the chemical, we have 2,4-D and dicamba. Both of these are common broadleaf herbicides. However, these herbicides are normally applied foliarly. That means that they are sprayed onto an actively growing plant in order to kill the plant. Now 2,4-D itself does not have any kind of activity in the soil, so having 2,4-D impregnated fertilizer, using that fertilizer to get the 2,4-D into the soil and then making the plant to take up that herbicide is not going to be effective. Now dicamba, on the other hand, it does have a limited activity in the soil, but it's still not very good. Both of these herbicides are much more effective spraying them on foliarly to an active growing plant. So in my opinion, buying a fertilizer product like this, that the rate is based upon the herbicide, but it's delivering the herbicide in a manner that's really not effective, is really a waste of money. And then looking at the guaranteed analysis that we can finally get to in the very fine print on the back of the bag, looks like we've got a guaranteed analysis of a 26-0-2. 26% nitrogen, no phosphorus, 2% potassium, and see the nitrogen is coming from urea and ammonium sulfate, and the potassium is coming from potassium sulfate. Now, based upon the weight of the bag of 11.32 pounds, in that analysis, this bag contains 2.94 pounds of N, 0.23 pounds of K, and 0.23 pounds of sulfur. Now, that little amount of potassium in there is not going to do anything for whatever you're trying to fertilize. But there is something on this analysis that you need to pay attention to. Nitrogen is a very critical element in the plant in helping it production of chlorophyll and grow. However, nitrogen by itself is not terribly effective. Nitrogen also needs sulfur in the plant, so both of them can work together to do the metabolic processes in the plant that is needed. And a good general rule of thumb is that you want about a 10-to-1 ratio of nitrogen to sulfur. And this bag is getting close to it. As you can see, we've got 26% nitrogen, and then a true 10-to-1 ratio of sulfur. The sulfur should be 2.6%. I mean, 2% is getting pretty close. So if you were to use this fertilizer, you could get full effect of the nitrogen because it's also got the appropriate amount of sulfur to go along with it. Moving on to the next product I saw, looks like we got a Scott's Turf Builder 3-in-1. It's got your seed, it's got your fertilizer, and it's got some kind of soil amendments in there also. Again, this is another combined product that I don't like because it's very rare that you're going to get the correct rate of all the different products that's in that bag. It says right here, this is supposed to cover 4,000 square feet. That's probably based upon the rate of seed that you need to apply, but it's probably not going to be the correct rate of fertilizer that you need to apply. So in my opinion, you're much better off buying these products separately. Buy your bag of grass seed that's got just the grass seed in it, and then buy your bag of fertilizer depending on what the nutrient requirements are going to be for the grass and based upon the amount of nutrients that's already in your soil. Now moving on, we got a liquid fertilizer here. This is a quart bottle weighing 2.6 pounds. It says this is supposed to cover 5,000 square feet and feed for up to 4 weeks. Well, I've already proven to you that the feeds for up to 4 weeks is completely irrelevant because they don't know the crops you're growing, the environment, etc. Now, with it weighing 2.6 pounds and having an analysis of 22-0-3, that means that this quart bottle has a little over a half of a pound of nitrogen in it and 8/100ths of a pound of potassium in it. Now, 5,000 square feet is going to be a little over 1/10 of an acre. So applying this product to over 5,000 square feet will be the equivalent of applying about 5 units of nitrogen. All right, moving on to the next one, we've got another weed and feed here. It says this has got a guaranteed analysis of a 15-0-0. And then looking down there at the very fine print, the active ingredients looks like it's 2,4-D. Up here in the top left-hand corner, it says that this is supposed to cover up to 7,500 square feet. Now, 7,500 square feet is going to be like 17% of an acre, you know, almost 2/10 of an acre. And then adding up the total active ingredients down there, we've got about 0.15 pounds of active ingredients. Now, I'm very familiar with 2,4-D, and that 15 pounds of active ingredient sprayed over 7,500 square feet is really about 2/3 of what you actually need to kill weeds. You'll probably ding some weeds up with this rate, but unless they're very small, you're probably not going to kill too many broadleaf weeds with this product. All right, and then looking at the fertilizer analysis on this, net weight 2.32 pounds at 15% nitrogen gives you a total of about 0.35 pounds of nitrogen if you were to, and that would be the equivalent of applying 1.74 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Not going to see any results. So the nitrogen in here is most likely in here to kind of act as a carrier and help the herbicide get into the plant a little bit better, but you're really not going to see any kind of fertilizer value out of it. All right, now let's get on to something that probably everybody knows about, your Miracle-Gro products. I mean, I doubt there's anybody out there that hasn't heard or seen an advertisement for Miracle-Gro, and based upon the name, sounds like that's all you need to make your plants grow. But let's take a look at the actual contents and the price levels and just see if Miracle-Gro is worth the premium price of a name brand. Now looking at this container here, it's one that you screw your garden hose onto. It's got some dry fertilizer in the container beneath it, and as you pull the trigger and spray water, it mixes with the fertilizer in there, dissolves the fertilizer, and the fertilizer goes out with the water. It looks like the net weight on this is 1 pound. And then looking here on the label, we see the guaranteed analysis. Looks like it's got a guaranteed analysis of a 24-8-16, but we've got a whole bunch of other stuff in there, a bunch of micronutrients. You know, got some boron, some copper, some iron, some manganese, molybdenum, and zinc. You know, these can be useful, but most likely your plants are not going to need it because it's going to be supplied by the soil. Now, looking up here at the very top, it says this 1 pound is supposed to cover 400 square feet. Well, is that recommendation going to be accurate? Well, based upon the analysis, this 1 pound container contains about 1/4 pound of nitrogen, 0.08 pounds of phosphorus, and 0.16 pounds of potassium. Now, if you were to convert that to a per acre rate, that comes out to about 27 pounds of nitrogen an acre, 8.7 pounds of phosphorus per acre, and 17.4 pounds of potassium an acre. That's a pretty decent slug of fertilizer there for plants that are maybe not nitrogen intensive, you know, probably some of your vegetables and stuff. You know, if you spread across 400 square feet, that's going to be a pretty reasonable dose of fertilizer there. However, at the price point they're wanting for it, is it going to be worth it? It looks like Walmart's wanting $13.78 for this pound of fertilizer. Now to make up that same pound of fertilizer, if I were to buy this fertilizer commercially and blend it together myself, it would cost me 12 cents in nitrogen, 6 cents in phosphorus, and 5 cents in potassium, for a total cost of 23 cents to make the same amount of fertilizer that Miracle Grow is asking $13.78 for. So while they got a lot of things right on their label and everything, you want some high priced fertilizer? Go get you some Miracle Grow. Now looking at this next Miracle Grow product, looks like this was formulated specifically for tomato, fruits, and vegetables, and it's supposed to feed up to 3 months, which we know there's a good chance is not accurate. Now it looks like we've got a 4.5 pound container here. Looking on the back in the small print, the guaranteed analysis, we got a 10-5-15. So based on this 4.5 pounds of total product, there's a total of 0.45 pounds of N, 0.23 pounds of phosphorus, and 0.68 pounds of potassium in here. Now, I didn't see any kind of recommendations for, how many square foot you're supposed to cover with this, but I would say based upon the nutrient analysis and what's actually in there, probably need to cover about the same area as the previous product. Now moving on to some of your organic fertilizers that you might find. Looking at this one right here, we can see plainly right there on the front of the bag, it's got analysis of 4-4-4, which is a pretty low nutrient concentration. And as I explained earlier in the video, your organics are going to be made up of organic products like chicken litter, manures, and maybe some other carbon-based products. And while it's a good source of fertilizer, the nutrient concentration is going to be quite lower, leading you to have to apply a lot more product to get the same amount of nutrients. Now looking on the back of this bag, it shows that this guaranteed analysis is derived from poultry manure, feather meal, bone meal, and sulfate of potash. Now, based upon that analysis, this 30-pound bag is going to have 1.2 pounds each of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in it. That's not saying that it's a bad source of fertilizer. I mean, it's good for long-term fertility. You're just going to have to buy a whole lot more of it to meet your fertility needs. Well, guys, I know I've thrown a lot at you, and this is probably kind of complicated, but hopefully now when you go into the store and you want to buy some fertilizer, you can now look and differentiate between all the different products, find the product that meets your needs, and also find the best value for your product. Now, if you want to know how much of these products you need to apply, be sure to stay tuned for our second video in this series, where we'll really dive off into the different types of fertilizer, the benefits of each type of fertilizer, and then fertilizing based upon what your actual needs are, based upon the amount of nutrients in your soil and the type of plants or crops that you're trying to go to meet their nutrition needs. Guys, I really appreciate y'all staying tuned and watching this video. If you'd like to support our channel, be sure to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. Lets YouTube know that we're doing a good job and you'd like to see more of that content. So appreciate y'all watching. Y'all stay tuned for part 2.